Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Trump's agenda includes everything from tax cuts to immigration, but how much is real and how much is bluster? Let's get to the bottom line. On paper, things couldn't look rosier for incoming U.S. President Donald Trump. His party controls really all the branches of government, and he's defeated his opposition soundly. Last time he won, the Democrats considered him an illegitimate and dangerous president, and many formed what was called the resistance. This time around, there's no such thing. Most of his day one talking points focus on tariffs, sealing the country's southern border with Mexico, carrying out the, quote, largest mass deportation operation in American history. Some of his executive orders can be effective right away, but some may get stuck in legislature or courts for years. So what exactly is the Trump agenda, and how much of it is really doable? Today we're talking with Tevi Troy, a former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services and author of several books on presidential history, most recently, The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between commanders-in-chief and titans of industry. And here with me in the studio is Niall Stanage, the White House columnist for The Hill. Thank you both for joining us today. We have an inauguration that is happening. We've got a new president coming in, a new era, I think. And I'd like to hear a little bit from President Trump on what he says he's going to do on day one. Let's listen.
On day one, I will launch the largest deportation program in American history to get the criminals out. I will rescue every city and town that has been invaded and conquered. They took away 625 million acres of offshore drilling. Nobody else does that. And they think they have it, but we'll put it back. I'm going to put it back on day one. I'm going to have it revoked on day one. And I will end the electric vehicle mandate on day one, thereby saving the U.S. auto industry from complete obliteration. With the stroke of my pen on day one, we're going to stop the transgender lunacy. I will ban refugee resettlement from terror-infested areas like the Gaza Strip. We will restore the travel ban, some people call it the Trump travel ban, and keep the radical Islamic terrorists out of our country.
Niall, I want you to give our audience a sense of the difference between statements like we just heard, and Donald Trump may be very, very committed to all of these goals and actually try and deal with them on day one. But the difference between sort of hyperbole and statements like this, and then what is achievable when it comes to real legislative and legal outcomes?
Well, sure. I mean, let's just look at the whole issue of immigration as one obvious example of this. It is obviously the case that President-elect Trump has promised a lot of sweeping change to immigration, mass deportations and all that kind of thing. The fact of the matter is that immigrants do have legal rights in this country, irrespective of whether they are legal migrants or not. And so there are issues of due process around that. People are entitled to claim asylum, for example, whether or not they entered the country legally or not. So in that kind of case, I think there will be challenges both in a legal sense, but also in a logistical sense. Obviously, you cannot carry out mass deportations of millions of people on day one, as the president-elect is fond of saying.
But do you have any doubt that President Trump doesn't actually believe what he says when he's going to deploy the military, he's going to deploy national resources to deport significant numbers of people very early? I mean, I think Stephen Miller, one of his key advisors, is very committed to that and to sealing the border. And I have to say that among Republicans, this is very, very popular. But among some Democrats, it's popular, too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is no question that immigration was a strong issue for President-elect Trump in November's election. And it was one where Democrats struggled. And that was partly because we have seen record numbers crossing the southern border dating back to around December last year, was when it hit its high point. The Biden administration would talk about how those numbers have declined since then. But there is no question at all that, electorally speaking, a harder, more hawkish approach on border security is popular.
Tevi, let me ask you about other dimensions of President Trump's montage that we just had there, you know, from EVs and, you know, drilling for more oil and gas and repealing a lot of Biden edicts and executive orders on this. You know, you've written so eloquently and expansively on lots of presidents. And I'd love to just get a snapshot from you on how you sort of see Donald Trump's, beginning, his early punctuation point, and how it compares to other early punctuation points of other presidents.
Well, Steve, thank you for having me. And we have seen an evolution in recent years from a legislative presidency to an administrative presidency. Presidents come in and say they're going to do this on day one, do that on day one. And with executive orders, they can do a great deal. Now, it may not be lasting. So the things that Biden did via the administrative state, Trump can undo. But that doesn't mean that whatever Trump does will last beyond his next Democratic successor. So I think there are a lot of things that Biden put into place regarding energy drilling limitations, for example, or encouraging people to come in illegally through the southern border that Trump can put a stop to. The question is, what's he going to be able to do legislatively? And the two big things that I think are number one on his docket are, what are you going to do about taxes? Because taxes will automatically go up if you don't change the current pathway. And the second thing is, can you reform the immigration system to a system that's more workable?
Well, President Trump is known to have undermined the last bipartisan, almost Republican-led legislative deal on immigration in the last Congress, right? So it was Senator Lankford from Oklahoma that was the lead on that. And Donald Trump wanted to run against the problem, not run fixing it. Now, to be fair, I remember I was, John Sweeney, the president of the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Labor, once told me when I worked in the Senate, this is not the time to fix problems. This is the time to complain, when he was fighting against the Republican administration. So I don't want to say that Donald Trump is just unique in that. But when you kind of look at the last deal that they had, do you, just in your sense of things, and you've served in government for a Republican administration, do you think they're going to resurrect that bipartisan deal?
I think there is a bipartisan deal to be had. I worked, to your point, I worked with George W. Bush in the White House on his immigration reform that came really tantalizing close. And then Harry Reid, who was the Democratic leader, undid it and kiboshed it in large part because of what you're saying. They wanted the problem more than the solution. So I think late in a president's cycle, as the Lankford deal came, is more likely a time when you talk about problems. And early in a president's term is a time when you're more likely to look at solutions. So I think there's a greater chance now of some kind of bipartisan deal than later in the president's term.
As we talk about this, what are your kind of historical lessons that you've learned about what it means when you think you've got control, but maybe less than you think if you're the president?
So I think that presidents do typically try to take as much expansive action as possible when that is the case, because they know it tends to be very short-lived. So if we go back to President Obama, for example, it was those strong majorities that let him try to at least push for expanded health care. Now, it was an enormous battle to get it through. As you will remember, Senator Ted Kennedy died, and the Democrats lost what had previously been considered a very safe seat in Massachusetts. And so you got into this whole issue of sort of congressional deal-making and horse trading. But look, I do think that for any president, particularly one serving a second term, as will be the case for Mr. Trump, you've got to use that political capital pretty quickly because it depletes very fast, whether that is through congressional losses or whether that is through the awareness that a president is approaching the end of his term.
Tevi, one of the other day one commitments that the president has made is universal tariffs. Not just shutting down immigration, but shutting down a lot of trade, essentially, but tariffs, Canada, Mexico, much of the world. And I think there are a lot of people out there that are saying, is he serious? Because that could start a very serious global trade war. Or is it going to be national security directed or directed at certain industries? And frankly, I'll be honest with the public right now watching this, you hear different things from different corners of the Trump administration. But what are your thoughts on day one tariffs?
Well, I'm loath to weigh in given your expertise on the trade subject, but I will say that there is a possibility that he's using it as a negotiating chip, especially with the Mexicans and the Canadians. He wants border controls, and he warns them that he'll do a tariff unless they change the way they are approaching the border situation. I think he's more serious about it with the Chinese, and you'll note that the Biden administration kept many of his tariffs on China. So I think we feel about like we're back in the 19th century with tariffs as a weapon that the president can deploy I personally lean more towards in the free trade camp. But if other countries aren't going to free trade, I see why President Trump wants to use this more as a tool to see if we can get better trade deals.
Do you think that there's a real sensitivity out there that many Americans, that Donald Trump could even potentially lose a lot of his supporters if he doesn't solve, the price of goods problem and the way people are, buying things and seeing what the cost of things are and bringing that somehow under control, and at the same time wanting to oppose tariffs, which to me just sounds inflationary immediately. But your thoughts, Tevi, and love to get yours as well, Niall.
Yeah, so my first thought on this is that Stephen Moore and Larry Kudlow are big advisors to Trump economically, and they have this animal spirits theory, which is that if you not only reduce regulations, but also signal to business that it's going to be a business-friendly and innovation-friendly environment, you will see economic gains. And that doesn't even require any real policy changes. And so I think he believes that he'll get some benefit from that. And there was some of the evidence of the animal spirits in the first Trump term. And then you get to these questions of tariffs, which, as you say, could be inflationary. Then there's the issue of the tax cuts that are going to go away. Obviously, we have this massive budget debt, and that needs to be addressed, although neither Harris nor Trump nor Biden signaled any real seriousness about going about changing it. So there are some larger underlying economic issues, but I think Trump's going to focus initially on the animal spirits and releasing them.
Now, what are your thoughts about animal spirits? And I find it fascinating. I've heard Stephen Moore speak to this, as Tevi has said. And at the same time, when you look at the markets and what they're anticipating from Trump, the markets, the stock markets and others are booming. There's a lot of anticipation of this, and I'm just wondering, when will the crash come? When will gravity hit?
Well, it may hit sooner rather than later. The stock market has been a bit choppy in the very recent past. But look, I think a couple of points here. One, we started this conversation talking about all the things that President Trump has promised to do on day one. In relation to price increases and inflation and the price of groceries, he has actually backed away from that slightly in more recent comments, talking about how that might take a little while. And second of all, this topic of rising prices is one that cuts against his protectionist America First instincts, because tariffs are viewed almost universally, not completely universally, but almost universally by economists as likely to increase inflationary pressures as the tariff gets passed along to American consumers. So I think there's a really interesting intersection and clash of Trump's impulses there.
Tevi, it's just impossible to think about this moment without thinking about Elon Musk and Donald Trump, who are each other's best buddies right now. I mean, it looks to me like maybe it'll go well, but it could also blow up and add another chapter, forcing you to revise your book. But your thoughts on their relationship?
Well, I think I did time the book, The Power of the Money, right, because of the heavy involvement of CEOs, and particularly Elon Musk, in this second Trump term. I think the incentives are for both of them to stick together right now. Trump benefits from Musk's celebrity, and he did so on the campaign trail as well. If the Doge can get some savings, or even if the Doge helps release the animal spirits, I think that's all good for Trump. Obviously, for Musk, it's a good thing for him to have the president in the White House who's not hostile to him, as Biden was. When Biden had a summit on electric vehicles, didn't even invite Musk, which kind of irked Musk. And then there was a whole bunch of enforcement actions that were taking place against Musk companies in the Biden years. So I think both of them have incentive to work together and stick together. And despite Steve Bannon's best interests, I see this alliance sticking together for now.
Do you think Elon Musk will pay a price in Donald Trump's commitment to end subsidies and the electric vehicle mandate?
I think that Tesla already has a big edge in the electric vehicle market. So if they were to reduce subsidies, Tesla still has the leg up. So I don't think that's the major concern for Musk right now. But you're right that Musk has benefited from government largesse over the years. Obama went to visit SpaceX when he was president in Florida. And then obviously green subsidies did help lead to the rise of Tesla. So Musk may have some challenges there. On the other hand, Musk can face headwinds if government treats him poorly, like they did in the Biden years, and more investigations of his many companies are a potential problem for him as well.
Now, what are your thoughts on the foreign policy front and Donald Trump as a disruptor, as a discontinuous force, which you say in political science, a moment of discontinuity, or do you see him continuing some of the things that Biden did?
He may continue some, but I do think he is fundamentally a disruptive force. Now, on the Ukraine question, I think that is one of the clearest elements in all of that. We were used to the Republican Party typically being the more hawkish and more interventionist, broadly speaking, in foreign wars. Donald Trump has remade the Republican Party in a much more Trumpy image in that way, a party that is now in many parts sceptical of continuing aid to Ukraine at the cadence and clip that it has been going at. I think that will obviously create a pressure for the Ukrainians to settle that conflict, even at the cost of some of their territory. In the Middle East, briefly, it has been really interesting to me, Steve, very recently, reading coverage in the Israeli media suggesting that Trump and his new Mideast envoy, Steve Witkoff, have actually put a bit of pressure on the Israeli government to come to a ceasefire deal. We didn't necessarily expect that, and I think it goes to your point about the disruptiveness and the...
And it looks like their pressure may have worked, whereas Joe Biden's pressure, when he's president, supplying weapons, that Joe Biden seemed unable to shift the course of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu one way or the other.
It appears to be, and certainly that's the talk in Israel, that some of that pressure has really accelerated this process to make some of the concessions, admittedly on very, stuff that's pretty deep in the weeds of a ceasefire agreement, but is movement all the same.
Tevi, I can't help but ask you, because you've followed so many other presidencies, and of course we know President Carter just recently passed away at 100 years old and had returned the Panama Canal back to its national boundaries, inside Panama. And I'm just interested in Donald Trump's desires to reacquire the Panama Canal, to acquire Greenland for national security reasons, which is essentially controlled and owned by Denmark, although many people in Greenland don't see it that way. But you've got and then talking about Prime Minister Trudeau, who just resigned, is resigning from the leadership of his party, but as Governor Trudeau, and talking about Canada as a 51st state. I'm interested in this because one of the big geopolitical challenges in the world right now, from a U.S. perspective, is China. But if you offend all your friends in that process, how do you actually put up any weight against China? Tevi?
Yeah, and also Russia. I mean, if the U.S. claims that national security concerns require it to take Greenland, what's the counter argument against Russia and Ukraine? But I think the
or China-Taiwan, right? Or China-Taiwan.
Yeah, or China-Taiwan. But the interesting thing going on here is that maybe at the end of the Trump term we'll have 54 states. We could have Canada and Greenland and Panama and Israel, and so it could be a very imperialist or expansionist presidency. Look, I don't think that he's serious about taking over those countries. He usually uses this stuff as a negotiating play. I think Jared Kushner's memoir from the first term was, I think, unjustly neglected because of a lot of bitterness about who Trump is and who Kushner is. But the fact is, it was very revealing about the way Trump goes into negotiations, about the way Trump will use his big pronouncements or his tweets while other of his people are involved in negotiations. I mean, it's not just a distraction strategy, but it's a strategy that's designed to kind of upset the apple cart, and maybe the negotiations go more favorably to you after the apple cart has been upset.
Are we kind of regressing from kind of an empirical, research-based, professional management of national problems, healthcare? Do you worry about that at all with some of the appointments, particularly of Robert F. Kennedy at HHS, which you used to help run?
Yeah, I'm not worried about that per se. I think there's been a sense in the last couple of years that we're not necessarily served perfectly by experts. There's been a long populist strain on the right. Bill Buckley famously said he'd rather be ruled by the first 2,000 names in the Cambridge phone book than by the Harvard faculty. So I don't think this is necessarily a new attitude in American politics. But obviously there are facts in the world. The famous line is that facts are stubborn things. And I would like if our experts on all sides of the aisle would adhere to them. I think we'd be better off that way.
Now, one of the other interesting dimples right now is that some of the leading icons of the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement, are Steve Bannon. They are ferociously committed to sealing the border, to keeping immigrants out, including highly skilled immigrants and H-1B visas. And a split has happened between that crowd and Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, who are very, very focused on defending highly skilled, educated immigrants coming in under visa. And Donald Trump, for this moment, is supporting them and not Steve Bannon. I'm really fascinated by the tectonics of this particular rip in the Republican establishment. What can you tell us?
I think it's one of the key rifts that we've seen so far, because what it does is place the nationalists, which is essentially the Steve Bannon faction, against a more business-friendly faction. Now, Bannon would argue, I think, that he is the real keeper of the MAGA flame in that way, that the MAGA movement was largely about right-wing populism, the idea that corporate elites were taking advantage of the plain people of America and so on and so forth. And so he sees those H-1B visas, for example, as a way that very, very rich people can import labour from overseas, even if it's skilled labour, and keep labour costs down, thus depriving native-born Americans of the wages that they would otherwise earn. Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, and increasingly Mr. Trump do not see it that way at all and are arguing that it is important for American innovation.
Are you surprised that Trump took their side?
Somewhat, because I think instinctively he is more on the Bannon side of the argument, but I think that, Elon Musk clearly has his ear in quite a big way at the moment.
Do you think Donald Trump could make a few of those compromises and actually lose his base? Or is his base with him through thick and thin?
I tend to think his base is so personally attached to him that they would support him through a lot of changes unless the underlying economic conditions were to go badly wrong.
Tevi, I want to ask you an unfair and final question here. What are you looking at? What are you looking for as distinctive features and defining features of this presidency so that we can look beyond the bluster, look beyond some of the surface noise of covering what really matters, and what would you tell our watchers they should be watching for in the future of this Trump presidency?
Well, I would say, you mentioned women. I'm watching Susie Wiles. She is the chief of staff. Trump has labeled her the Ice Maiden. She did a very good job of tamping down infighting and leaking and a lot of noise in the Trump campaign. And she signaled that she wants to do the same in the Trump administration, the second Trump administration. Well, Trump had 4 chiefs of staff last time, and they were unable to assert control over the infighting and over the leaking. So if she manages to hold on and to keep her position and to keep a tight rein on the process, then I think you'll have a better run Trump administration than the first one.
Well, there we have it. Great discussion, gentlemen. Ronald Reagan Institute Senior Fellow Tevi Troy and the Hill's White House columnist Niall Stanage, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? President Donald Trump, the sequel, is going to be a wild ride. Some of the time, there are huge gaps between his hyperbolic speeches and actual achievable policy reality. But sometimes those gaps are small. He said that he wants to deploy the military to remove folks who don't have residency documents from the United States. He might just do that. We've heard from him that he wants vengeance against his enemies and those that opposed him in Congress on the January 6th committee, even from his own party. He may go after them with fully legal investigations by the FBI and Department of Justice. Despite the horrific fires in Los Angeles, Trump has threatened California's governor, a Democrat, to cut off funds possibly to fight those fires and aid to those families. He may just do that, but he hasn't yet. Finding that vein of what's real and what's bluster is going to be a constant effort over the next 4 years. And that's the bottom line.